Well, this may not seem like a wise move in January, but today we're moving north over the Alps to what would become the nations of France, Belgium, Holland, and parts of Germany. The Northern Renaissance artists are among my very favorite, but when I taught this unit last year, I picked up that my students really didn't share my enthusiasm. The problem, I think, is that these paintings really need to be seen in person, that is, in a museum or a church, not as a slide or photo in a book. The great innovation of the Northern Renaissance artists was the introduction of oil painting. This new medium gives these paintings a whole new range of color and the emotion that only oil can truly capture. The Northern Renaissance artists were masters of detail as well, especially domestic household details, many of which had symbolic meanings. In other words, these paintings really reward close and up-close study. But I'll do my best. Let's start out with a video introduction to the art of the Northern Renaissance. This is a new video, and I'll be using it quite a lot in the next 2 lectures. We're not only moving north for this unit, we're moving back in time to the 1400s, the world of Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Botticelli, and even immediately before that. When we look at these illuminated manuscript pages, it seems as if we're really returning to the Middle Ages, the era of lords and peasants, of rival nobles commanding often small fiefs from fortified castles, the world of knights on horseback and serfs working in the field. This world lives on in this beautiful book of ours, or Guide to Daily Prayers, created by the Limburg brothers for the Duke of Berry, the younger brother of the King of France. What do the brilliant colors remind you of? How about the stained glass windows of high Gothic French cathedrals? And what about that sumptuously detailed clothing? What style does it evoke? Remember the International Gothic, which was very popular with the courts of Northern Europe. Note that there are no obvious bodies under these clothes. By the way, I've cropped off the zodiac signs at the top of these images to capture more detail. These book of hours are College Board favorites, and they will show up on one of your test essays. So here we see courtly dress and highly stylized horses. Yet only 6 months of the calendar are devoted to the nobility. The other months show scenes from the life of peasants, what art historians call genre painting, or painting of scenes from everyday life. Sometimes these scenes of ordinary people are romanticized, sometimes they're starkly realistic. But the inclusion of genre scenes still represents a departure in art and hints that the lower classes are going to find a new place in painting, just as they're going to find new roles in society. We see some other Renaissance hints in the second genre painting. What are they? Well, there's a touch of perspective. Notice how the line of shrubbery moves in a slight angle at the back. The castle's really not correct from the standpoint of one-point perspective. Still, the artists have carefully employed shading to give it 3 dimensions. At the same time, the world that the Limburg brothers captured in their wonderful book of hours is, as I said before, a feudal world, where territories, often quite small, were ruled by powerful nobles, where kings for the most part were quite weak, and where the economic and social gulf between lords and peasants was huge and almost never breached. In this world, popes and kings fought for political and economic control, often quite literally on the battlefield. Julius II wasn't called the warrior pope just because he got into so many quarrels with Michelangelo. So what changed all that? Why did feudalism end and give way to what non-art historians call early modern Europe? I've given you some of the answers in earlier units, but that was way back before Christmas break. Remember any of that? Remember what the tragedies of the 14th century were? Well, one of them was the plague, which killed off as much as half of the population. So what effect do you think this would have on the relations between nobles and serfs? Well, think about it this way. What would happen to high school students earning minimum wage at part-time jobs and to their employers if senioritis became fatal and spread to other grades and half the high school students in America dropped dead? Well, you'd spend a lot of time attending funerals, but you'd also gain some serious economic bargaining power as McDonald's and Starbucks started fighting for the remaining teenage labor. Similarly, nobles eager to keep their remaining serfs on the land had to grant these serfs more rights, and many left anyway to occupy now abandoned lands or work for more accommodating nobles or to take up trades in the growing towns. Any guess what this is showing? Well, another 14th century tragedy was the schism in the Catholic Church, as the papacy first moved to Avignon in France and then suffered through a period where there were competing popes in Avignon and in Rome. This is a painting by Vasari. Remember him? He was the architect who was also an art historian. It shows the return of the popes to Rome, an event that loomed very large in our last unit. But what would you guess the impact of the church split up was in the north? Well, basically, the schism in the church severely weakened the pope's authority, since competing popes needed to appeal to political rulers for support. England, for example, supported the popes in Rome, but that's because they wanted to weaken France. The French, as you might expect, liked having popes living in their backyard in Avignon. For ordinary people, however, the discord in the church, combined with what seemed like the clergy's growing corruption and preoccupation with wealth, led to a search for a more individual and personal religion. Northern Europeans did not turn away from Christianity, but many began to join confraternities or religious organizations that were not made up of clergy. Others focused more on personal devotion and paid for art that helped them in this pursuit. The art is not any less Christian, but it is less inclined to celebrate the church hierarchy. So, for example, Perugino's painting of Jesus handing the keys of Rome to St. Peter would not have resonated in the same way in the north. But it wasn't just tragedy that reshaped Europe emerging in the 15th century. Inventions and ingenuity made a big difference as well. We'll talk about one of those inventions, the printing press, when we get to the Reformation. But let's start with a different one. Back when I taught AP European History at Juan Diego, I told my class on the first day of school that we were beginning the course rather arbitrarily on August 26, 1346. I made them try to guess what that meant, but I'll go ahead and tell you that this is the date of the Battle of Crécy, which is one of the many battles of the extremely complicated 100 Years' War. Any guesses as to why I picked that date? Well, let's watch a portion of the video clip that I used to start off my AP European history classes from a series called War and Civilization. And then I'm going to pose the question again. By the way, I'm skipping over some of the fun details about the battle. If you're interested, feel free to watch more of the video on Moodle. The first 10 minutes or so cover this battle. So, have you guessed why I started early modern history with this battle? As the video tells you, it's estimated that more than a third of French knights died on that single day. And they were defeated by a bunch of upstart English peasants with longbows. As the narrator notes, warfare after Crécy belonged increasingly to the infantry, ending the reign of knights on horseback. Raising and maintaining a large infantry army, though, was expensive, and it was a job more easily taken on by large political entities, kings rather than nobles with a small fief. Once armaments makers figured out how to make cannons and then muskets that could actually hit what they were aimed at, fortified castles no longer provided much protection either. This also made it easier for kings to bring unruly nobles under control, and it gave still more importance to the common soldiers, this time the artillery. So, in this period, and even more in the period that follows, we're going to see the rise of what historians call the new monarchies, powerful kingdoms in Spain, France, and England. Italy, by contrast, would suffer under these changes. Its smaller city-states had trouble raising an infantry army, and its small mercenary forces could no longer defend it against the major infantry armies of these new monarchies. So Italy would be invaded and sacked by both the Holy Roman Empire and France in the late 15th and 16th centuries. Finally, the commercial revolution that I talked about when we talked about Florence moved north of Italy, especially after Portuguese and Spanish navigators discovered the New World and the center of trade moved to the Atlantic. The center of the northern commercial revolution was Flanders, an area that now encompasses Holland, Belgium, and northern France. In this unit, Flanders is ruled first by the Dukes of Burgundy and then by the Holy Roman Empire. You can see from the map that Flanders was strategically located for trade with England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. The flat topography, or landscape, also made land travel into the heart of Europe relatively easy. Like Florence, Flanders included significant, rich industrial banking cities that allowed a large middle-class population to flourish. The court of the Dukes of Burgundy was also very important for patronage during this time, but so were newly wealthy private citizens who commissioned art as part of a growing interest in private meditation and prayer and art that furthered that devotion. This rising middle class also commissioned portraits in growing numbers. Yeah, I realize this is a very complicated map. It's actually why I included it. The Dukes of Burgundy acquired Flanders through a series of dynastic marriages and complex feudal arrangements. Here you see the areas ruled by the Burgundian kingdom. The northern orange portions are Flanders. It was in Burgundy that the international style, remember that focus on costly materials, elegant upper-class subjects, beautifully dressed, that's where it reached its height, but it's also where the international style began to give way to a new Northern Renaissance aesthetic. Philip the Bold of Burgundy loved the Carthusian order of monks, and he designated this Carthusian monastery in Dijon as his final resting place. The hexagonal or six-sided fountain depicts 6 patriarchs and prophets: Moses, David, Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zechariah. Originally, a crucifix topped the fountain, with the water of life flowing symbolically from the cross. Now, I've juxtaposed jam sculptures from Chartres Cathedral about a century and a half earlier. So what differences do you notice? Well, Slaughter's figures are less angular, the drapery is more free-flowing, and in general, the figures are more liberated from their architectural framework. That's very important. We also see more differentiation of texture, although it's a little tough to pick this up from the slide. But this will turn out to be a major characteristic of Northern Renaissance work, especially when it comes to painting fabric and metal or glass surfaces. Really, nobody ever does it better. Here you see more detail from the statues. Although only a few flakes of paint remain, the statues would originally have been vividly painted, which would have made them even more naturalistic. This video clip will give you a better look at this very important work. So we've seen the well from the Carthusian monastery. Here's the altarpiece from the monastery chapel, also commissioned by Philip the Bold. Love that name. As your textbook notes, the paintings mix and match architectural styles. It may be that the classical rotunda refers to the Old Testament, while the Gothic porch refers to the New, or we may be seeing a combination of older Gothic and newer Renaissance styles. The depiction of the buildings and landscape, to me, seem to echo the works by Giotto and the Sienese artists such as Duccio. But what other ways do the works seem to blend medieval and the Renaissance? Well, the gold background and the rather flat, stylized figures are medieval, so are the very defined halos. But the wild landscape, the use of architecture to render three-dimensional space, these signal a move toward the Renaissance. As this diagram indicates, the artist's efforts to render three-dimensional space are not altogether successful, at least by later Italian Renaissance standards. There are multiple vanishing points, confusing orthogonals. Remember, we're still half a century before Brunelleschi really formalizes one-point mathematical perspective. Still, this painting represents a move toward a more optical art. Here's a short video clip about this work. I love this altarpiece, which I just saw again this fall when I was at the Cloisters, which is the medieval museum of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was not made for a chapel or a church. It was made for the patrons to keep in their home on a small altar designed for private devotions. So while our previous altarpiece included many naturalistic elements, the setting still seemed fanciful. It wasn't a real place where real human beings might have lived. In this altarpiece, the separation between heaven and earth is challenged. The patrons are kneeling outside the kitchen where the Annunciation takes place, but still, you could easily imagine that the room is a real room in their home. This is the earliest Annunciation panel set in a fully detailed domestic interior. Here, too, the artist has made a consistent attempt to render a complete spatial reality, although it's still not the same space from one panel to another. And despite the fact that it is not an accurate perspective, every detail is made concrete. The meticulous rendering of the smallest details is enhanced by what was still a technical innovation, oil paint, specifically overlaying translucent oil pigments on an aqueous opaque pigment. The result is a luminous enamel-like surface that includes many color values and manages to depict both depth and gradations of light in a way that really fresco could not. We'll talk more about oil painting in a minute. But the initial impression that this is an ordinary space is deceptive. Many of these seemingly ordinary objects have a second symbolic meaning. The artist's goal seems to have been making sacred symbols look like part of the natural world. This union of symbolism and realism is characteristic of many 15th century Northern European paintings, and it's something the College Board wants you to know about, hint, hint. It's a union which makes the secular world sacred and which may help explain why donors wanted their portraits included in the altarpieces and other religious paintings they commission. So, for example, the lily in the pitcher of water symbolizes the Virgin's purity. The candle symbolizes Christ's divinity, and the fact that it's been extinguished suggests that Christ has put on human flesh. The mousetrap that Joseph is making, this is really my favorite part, demonstrates that Christ's incarnation, which is being announced in that central panel, is God's plan for ensnaring the devil. This comes from a writing by St. Augustine, that God appearing as Jesus in the incarnation was the way God would ensnare the devil, much as bait entraps a mouse. Note, by the way, how exquisitely the artist has rendered the tools and the metal surface of the candlestick. Again, no one does textures and surfaces better than the painters of the Northern Renaissance and their artistic heirs, whom we will meet in Dutch Baroque painting. So what makes this detail possible? The answer, in part, is oil painting. But to discuss this extraordinarily important new medium, we should turn to its master, Jan Van Eyck. We don't know that much about Van Eyck's personal background or training, although his inscription suggests that he probably had a classical education. In 1425, he entered the service of Philip the Good of Burgundy, whom he served not only as a court painter, but also as a diplomat and administrator. This is probably a self-portrait. I'm going to discuss Van Eyck's portraits in my second lecture on the Northern Renaissance. But let's watch another clip from our video to get an introduction to this extraordinarily important figure in art history. This is a must-know fellow right up there with the Ninja Turtles from the last unit. Note, by the way, that the video clip starts out by talking about illuminated manuscripts, specifically the kind of books of hours we saw at the beginning of this lecture. This was where Van Eyck probably got his start, and very early, as you'll see, displayed his genius. Before the printing press and the Reformation brought the Bible to Northern European masses, altarpieces were one of the most important devices for teaching the Christian narrative and Christian theology. Most were mostly viewed closed. These polyptychs, or connected multi-panel paintings, would be open during Mass and feast days to reveal an incredible world of color and action inside. The series of images allowed artists to create a narrative without employing the somewhat more awkward technique of continuous narration, which we've seen before. This huge altarpiece, it's 11.5 by 15 feet when open, still stands in St. Bavo Cathedral in Ghent, a city that is now part of Belgium. We see the wealthy donors at the bottom left and right. contrasting with the grisaille. Remember, that's the gray-scaled fake sculpture painting. So grisaille, fake sculptures of the prophets Zechariah and Micah, whom Christian theologians viewed as predicting Christ's incarnation. Above, we see Sibyls. Do you remember Sibyls from the Sistine Chapel ceiling? In the center is an Annunciation with a dramatic, almost empty center that looks through the window at a Flemish city and invites us into the story. I realize, or at least I hope, that you've already watched podcasts about this work. I think our video gives a slightly different perspective, and it's hard to say too much about this work, which represents one of the true turning points in art history. I've said I'll talk about portraits in my next lecture, but it's worth noting the highly realistic, and in this case, not especially flattering portrayals that would be typical of Flemish and Dutch painting. One interesting detail. Remember the Scrovegni, the donor of the Arena Chapel, so brilliantly painted by Giotto, was worried about how Dante had portrayed his father as suffering in hell for usury? Well, this donor's father had been the Duke of Burgundy's treasurer and was imprisoned for theft. So this hugely expensive donation was a peace offering to the kingdom and presumably a down payment on his journey to heaven. So a few noteworthy elements in this central panel. Unlike the grisaille figures of the saints at the lower level, these figures are modeled in the soft tones of unbleached muslin, making the iridescent angel's wings an even greater contrast. Note, too, that spoken words are included in the painting and that Mary's are upside down so they could be more easily read by God. I love that detail. The towel, the pitcher, and the ewer in the central panels all symbolize, what would you guess? Mary's virginity and purity. The trefoil window symbolizes the Trinity. Once the palptic is opened, we enter this incredible, brilliantly colored world with multiple layers of meaning. Note that the bottom landscape is continuous across the painting, with the Lamb and the well of water of life centered directly below God the Father. The nude figures of Adam and Eve represent an innovation in Northern Renaissance art, probably reflecting an Italian influence. And although we're talking about a Northern Renaissance and an Italian Renaissance, it's important to note that artists travel back and forth. We'll talk about this more when we look at Dürer, when we move to the Reformation art. The highly realistic, detailed, individualized faces are typical of Northern Renaissance painting. Note, too, Adam's foreshortened foot and Eve's partly contrapposto stance. So we're seeing some exchange of ideas. Just a humorous note, in the 19th century, the cathedral officials became nervous about Adam and Eve's nudity, and the figures were repainted with clothes. In the 20th century, the church officials came to their senses and the clothes came off. So how is God portrayed? Well, he's wearing a papal tiara and has a worldly crown at his feet. This is not a Reformation image, and this is an indication that the papacy had not lost all its power in Northern Europe at this time. Mary is the Queen of Heaven. Inscriptions top all three figures. The one over God the Father reads, "This is God, all-powerful in his divine majesty, of all the best by the gentleness of his goodness, the most liberal giver because of his infinite generosity." So while the symbolism of scepter, crown, and tiara suggests the powerful Byzantine world ruler, the language and God's calm and peaceful face convey the message of Christian humanism and the Christ being preached by the co-fraternities that I mentioned earlier. Note, too, the use of hierarchy of scale. Byzantine and medieval conventions have not yet disappeared. By the way, these figures were probably painted by Jan Van Eyck's brother, Hubert, who began the work. Jan Van Eyck finished it after his brother's death. One of the lectures I listened to stated that these are the only angels in Flemish painting that don't have wings. Interesting. But note the beautifully rendered cloth and the extremely detailed, didn't try to switch the slide there, extremely detailed musical instruments. Again, hallmarks of Flemish and Dutch painting. Also note the highly individual faces expressing very different responses to the music. Well, in the bottom central panel, symbols abound. So what do you see? Well, of course, there's the Lamb of God, whose heart is bleeding into a chalice, which symbolizes the Eucharist. The octagonal fountain of life spews forth living water. A slide does not capture Van Eyck's mastery of color and texture. While he's no longer considered the inventor of oil painting, he was one of its great masters. Oil paints permitted more nuanced textures, more translucent portrayal of light, and more modulated color, more color variation. So what shape defines this composition? It's a pyramid, which was also popular in the Italian Renaissance and symbolic of the Trinity. The perspective is intuitive rather than mathematical. Brunelleschi would not have approved. Here's a closer look at what is sometimes referred to as the mystic lamb. The symbolism could not be clearer. So I've talked about Van Eyck's compositional style and the symbolic way he approaches the Christian story. But what made this painting so remarkable, is actually a major tourist attraction almost from the day it was painted, was Van Eyck's extraordinary use of a new painting technique. I'm going to close this lecture with one last clip, this time about painting in oil.